Hi. This is MOOG ONE. It's Moog's only in-production polyphonic synth. It's tri-timbral, meaning that you can use any of its voices to play one of up to 3 completely different sounds at the same time. It's an analog synth with either 8 or 16 sets of voices, and it's programmable, meaning you can save presets on it. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look both at the pros and cons of MOOG ONE, as well as how everything works. And first up, it's impossible to ignore neither the size or price tag of MOOG ONE. The 8-voice one costs $6,000 and the 16-voice is $8,000. They're big and heavy, so assuming one has enough organs to sell and real estate to place it, the question is it worth it? Now, full disclosure, before I talk about value, Moog was kind enough to send over this review unit, but what I can tell you is this. Before I ever had this channel, as a synth nerd minding his own business, I bought a Moog Sub 37, meaning that I felt happy enough to pay around $1,500 for a single analog voice with 2 oscillators, a single filter. Each and every one of one's either 8 or 16 voices are on their own by far more powerful in many respects. 3 oscillators instead of 2 with much more flexibility, 3 filters per voice instead of just 1, and much more. And though there's no drive control like the Sub 37, you get 8 or 16 copies of these voices instead of just 1, not to mention the effects and many other things we'll talk about. So while I don't think that any synth purchased for this amount can be considered a value purchase, MOOG ONE represents a lot more Moog per dollar than any of its previous synths. I'll dive into everything, but before I do, I want to talk about something that's just as important in my opinion as sound or sheer amount of features, and that's ease of use. Packing plenty of features into a synth is something many synth manufacturers do. So the biggest question you need to ask yourself, I think, after price and value is it easy and fun to use? Features aren't worth much if they're not accessible, and I don't care much about a fantastic feature that's buried 3 menu levels deep on a tiny screen. The clever way Moog got around the problem of putting many features in endless menus is the combination of the More button on many of the modules and the soft encoders and buttons using a high-res screen. Let's take a look, for example, at the envelopes. Each of the 3 main envelopes has 4 knobs for A DSR and 4 buttons. But the envelopes are actually 6-stage envelopes, not 4-stage envelopes, with quite a bit of additional functionality beyond that. When you press the More button on the corner of any one of the modules, let's press this one for example, the screen changes and these soft knobs let you change the parameters that are highlighted, and this, the master encoder, lets you scroll up and down between different rows of parameters. In this case, there are 2 rows, but some modules have more than 2 rows. For example, the LFO module, I'll press its More button, it has 4 rows of parameters. So if I want to change this parameter, say the LFO range from low to medium to high, I do it using the soft encoder. So you should check out if you're comfortable with this workflow, because this is how you really access the full potential of MOOG ONE. So certainly these additional features take time to learn, explore, and use, but where they're at just makes sense in many cases. I've reviewed synths and sequencers with substantially less features than MOOG ONE that were a lot harder to use than this. Okay, so with that said, let's take a look at the hardware. The synth part of MOOG ONE, which is roughly the top 2/3 of the panel, is organized by modules, pretty much like any other Moog synth, except there's more of everything. 4 LFOs, 3 oscillators, a ring mod, noise section with its own envelope, a comprehensive mixer section, 3 filters instead of 1, and 3 envelopes. So all this top part is basically repeated for every single one of the 8 or 16 voices in Moog One, depending which one you get. Then you have additional features that are per synth, like the effects or master effects that are global, the sequencer and arpeggiator that are per synth as well. So there are 3 copies of each of these. So just to demonstrate this concept of 3 different synths or 3 different timbres, the part that I played in the intro to this video has 3 separate synths running in it. You can turn panel control or keyboard control on or off for any one of the 3 synths. So for example, if I check out synth 1, it makes the arpeggiated pattern that I started with. And I can turn that on or off and then move to synth 2 or synth 3. They live in splits over here. Notice as I turn them on, they get activated each in their respective split. So here I've got this timbre on the bottom part of the keyboard and then this on the top part. Now all 3 of course can run simultaneously, right? So I can run the arpeggiator here, hold it, then turn this off so it no longer accepts keys. Go to synth 2, press that. Synth 3 is in this split. Right, all 3 synths running simultaneously. Anyway, back to the tour. The key bed has 5 octaves and it's velocity sensitive with aftertouch, though not polyphonic aftertouch. Moog has said they plan to support poly aftertouch over MIDI in a future firmware upgrade. The left-hand controller has an XY touchpad, which is also pressure sensitive, so it's really XYZ, in addition to pitch and mod wheels. The pitch bend wheel and mod wheels are made of metal and are quite heavy to the touch. This is the only part of Moog One where I'd say it's too premium, meaning that I would have rather had lighter controls or at the very least grooves on the wheels because they're a bit too hard to turn unless you target the notch. Moog says that this is intentional so that when you set a mod amount, the wheel doesn't turn by accident if you hit it. If you don't feel that way and need quick manual modulations, the XY pad can be used for more effortless modulation, even with a pinky while, say, playing bass notes. The XY pad can behave either like a joystick, meaning that if you touch any spot, it'll spring back to the center when you leave it, or if you press XY hold, it will remember and keep the position you press on it. Key to Moog One and something that can't be taken for granted with analog synths is that it can save presets. So everything on the entire panel, each of the 3 synths or 3 timbres, as well as the overall knob positions on a per synth basis, everything can be saved in a preset. Finally, on the hardware side for the front, the panel is angled, but it's fixed at this angle so it doesn't swivel up or down. On the back are 2 sets of stereo outputs. You can assign each of the 3 synths to either one or both. Moog One has 4 insert jacks, both for sends and returns. You've got 2 CV inputs and 4 CV outputs for Eurorack connectivity. CV inputs can be used as mod sources in the mod matrix, and CV outputs can be controlled by the pitch, mod wheel, XY pad, as well as MIDI CCs. If you need additional CV inputs, you can use the 2 expression pedal inputs as well as the sustain jack on the back. You also have MIDI in, through, and out on the back, a LAN jack for remote servicing, 2 USB ports, both a host and device. You can use the host jack on the back to connect thumb drives or a class-compliant MIDI device like a keyboard, controller, or sequencer. And you can use the USB device jack to send MIDI out over USB or receive MIDI, say, from a computer or USB sequencer. You can get one of those small USB keyboards, by the way, to type in preset names. Just leave that on the back, I guess, and use that whenever you need to rename a preset. Presets also have notes that you can type in. So that's extremely useful when you want to recall what it is exactly that's going on in your preset. Now, if you want to access the jacks on the back a lot, it is a bit of an inconvenience because this doesn't move easily. I recommend either having a mirror nearby or your phone in selfie mode to find the right jack. Another option is a custom I/O decal that Sweetwater sells for about $20 that you can apply to the wood on the frame on the back, and that's a pretty cool solution too. Back to the tri-timbral aspect of Moog One. As I mentioned before, you have 3 separate timbres or synths that can live together at any given time in a preset. You can choose a keyboard range for any one of the 3 synths or turn the keyboard on or off for that synth, and panel focus lets you control the parameters of each synth individually. So for example, if I wanted to control the timbre of space waves, which is synth 2 in this case. I press here, and then all these knobs control, say, the filter of space waves. If I wanted to change the timbre of the in search of pad, I just press synth 3. And now the panel controls the timbre of synth 3. There are quite a few per synth parameters to control in the VCA More menu. For example, the separate levels of the individual synths. And then there's stereo panning. And on the Output More button, you get control of a few additional parameters, like through which output the audio will be sent, or where the inserts are sent to. Okay, let's dive into what each individual synth voice can do. For that, you hit Shift and Compare, and you get an init preset. Let's take a look at the basic synth engine, which starts as expected with the tone generators. Each MOOG ONE voice has 4 or 5 of them, depending on how you count. 3 oscillators, a noise generator, and a ring mod generator that has its own separate input in the mixer. Each of the 3 core oscillators generates 2 waveforms simultaneously. On the left, you have a choice of either triangle or saw, and on the right, you have a variable pulse wave. Each of the oscillators has a 5-octave range. That's, of course, the relationship between the oscillators. You can also move up and down the octaves using these controls on the left-hand controller. If you hit More, by the way, you'll get a visualization of what's going on in the oscillator. You've got fine-tune, frequency control, and a beat frequency control, which is a fine-tune control that is also designed to produce consistent beating across the oscillator range. Both the saw and triangle waveforms have a wave angle control. For the triangle, it'll move from triangle to a saw and back, so this is a great way to control harmonics without even touching the filter. Same goes for saw. Gives it a little angle, right, changing the harmonics a bit. And you've got mix control here, right? So it starts with the saw and triangle. I can bring in the square wave. You've got pulse width control on that. It goes all the way through 0. And then oscillators 2 and 3 have a hard sync option, which forces the oscillator's waveform to reset according to oscillator 1. Yep, and yeah, the oscillators are right what you'd expect from a Moog synth, that's for sure. One note about both these OLED screens and the display on the screen here, it's a representation of what's going on with the waveform, but it's not a scope. So if you modulate pulse width or wave angle, you won't see that either here or here. Most of the oscillator functions are accessible on board, but there are a few more functions here. For example, a cool feature is pitch bend up and down and offset on pitch bend, so you could have the oscillators pitch bend differently when you move the pitch bend wheel. Aside from modulations that you can generate in the mod matrix from the envelopes or the LFO, there are a few dedicated modulations on board for the oscillators. There is a direct pitch bend connection from LFO 1 and from the mod envelope. Well, that's this guy here. A convenient connection for waveform modulation from LFO 3, as well as pulse width modulation. The oscillator section is also where you'll find the ring mod and frequency mod, or FM, functions. Like I mentioned before, ring mod has its own dedicated input in the mixer, which is very convenient because it tends to be metallic and noisy, and it's nice to be able to control its level alongside the other oscillators. You can ring mod either oscillators 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. Let's say, for example, 1 and 2. FM has a few options too. Can be either between oscillators 1 and 2, 1 and 3, or 3 and 1. Since we're listening to oscillator 3, let's put it on a 1 to 3 relationship. So we're listening to oscillator 3, and there's an FM amount that we can control. right? Which of course depends on the frequencies of these oscillators. Now, analog FM isn't like digital DX7 style frequency modulation, but it has its own very unique timbral nooks and crannies. Okay, let's move on from the oscillators to the noise generator. You can choose between a few options that you can mix amongst. So go from white to red, which is bassier, or from red to purple, which has abundant high frequencies, or from white to purple. A neat function in the noise generator is that it has its own attack release or attack sustain release envelope, which is a pretty nice bonus because you don't need to mess with routing envelopes to the noise generator. Okay, let's move on down the signal chain to the mixer. You saw me using this quite a bit before. You've got 5 sources on the panel, 3 oscillators, ring mod, and the noise generator. And there's a 6th option if you hit the more button. There's a jack in the back for external audio. You can control the level here. And this, along with the 5 other sources, can be sent to either one of the 2 filters, the state variable filter or the ladder filter. Let's talk about them. So there are a few special things going on in the filter section. First, each voice has 3 filters, a pair of state variable filters, and a single ladder filter. Like I mentioned before, you can route any one of the 6 audio sources to either the state variable filter, ladder filter, or both. So let's first take a listen to them and see what the differences are. The ladder filter is the classic Moog ladder filter. This is without any resonance. As you increase resonance, you lose bass, as is typical. Right. That's the Moog sound, and it will self-oscillate. So even if we turn this off, you'll get a sine wave. And there are a few slope options, 24 dB, 18 dB, 12 dB, and 6 dB. And it has a low pass and high pass mode as well, with its own ladder filter high pass style character. So that's the ladder filter. A state variable filter isn't something you see every day in a Moog. Same sawtooth. No resonance, by the way. Right, so that's a sweep of the low pass filter. Resonance doesn't impact the bass. And it doesn't self-oscillate either. So you can pick off the harmonics, but it won't self-oscillate, it won't make its own sound. And it also has a notch filter mode. Maybe we'll take a listen to this on noise. And so, notch filter without resonance, with bandpass, with resonance, and high pass, without resonance, and with. Back to normal. Right. High pass with resonance, without, notch, bandpass, and high pass. Now, before I mentioned 3 filters, and you've only heard 2, it turns out the state variable filter is actually state variable filters. There's 2 of them in here. You control their spacing using the spacing parameter. You can see this on screen here, as well as on the scope. And that gets very nicely into forming territory. All of these, by the way, are of course modulatable destinations. Like the oscillators, the filters also have their own little modulation module with quick access modulations from the filter envelope, LFO2, and an FM amount that can come from any one of the three oscillators. And this is either for the state variable filter, for the ladder filter, or both. The routing of the two filters can be either in parallel or serial, one after the other. You can control the mix between the two using this knob. And then finally, on the More panel, you've got filter tracking, filter key tracking, both for the ladder filter and state variable filter. This goes up to 200%. 100% is supposed to properly track with the keyboard so you can play the filter. I noticed that that tuning doesn't work, at least as of version 1.1 of the firmware. I asked Moog about this and they said that they're working on that for a potential firmware upgrade in the future. Okay, let's move on and take a look at what's special about Moog One's envelope generators. It has 3 identical complex envelope generators and another simpler envelope in the noise generator. And the LFOs can also be used as interesting envelope generators. More on that in a bit. By default, the envelopes are routed to the VCA, to the amplifier, to the filter, and the modulation envelope can be routed to oscillator pitch like we saw before, but you can route them almost anywhere you want in the synth. The envelope generators are identical. You've got the typical attack, decay, sustain, and release controls here. And when you hit the More button, you get access to 2 additional stages, a delay, which is set by time, and a hold time, which is a stage in between the attack and the decay. Other options on the More screen are curves, either logarithmic or exponential for any one of the stages. The envelopes can be set to be tempo synced, in which case notice all the timings become in relation to the sequencer rather than absolute millisecond timings. Loop will loop the envelope and then latch will just keep the loop going regardless of whether you're holding the key or not. If you have loop off, then latch will keep the envelope at the sustain level. Finally, the destination button lets you map the envelopes to any destination you like, not just those that are pre-wired. So say, for example, that I wanted to control just the pitch of oscillator 1 with this envelope. I hit destination, turn the knob for oscillator 1 frequency, set the mod depth, and now I have control over oscillator 1 pitch with this envelope. Once I hit done, this becomes a mod matrix entry. We'll get to that in a bit. So the envelopes are one interesting mod source. Obviously, all the way to the left are the LFOs. You've got 4 of them per voice. Let's delete this and abuse oscillator 1 frequency with the LFOs. So same deal here. Pick a destination for the LFO. Let's choose oscillator 1 frequency. This is the LFO rate. Depth is set here. Right. 4 shapes on the panel. And of course, more options on screen here. Most notably, aside from ranges, which go up to 1000 Hertz, are the variations in shape. So a variation for triangle is sine wave. For the pulse is pulse width. From saw to round. And for the random LFO, you can turn into noise. I won't go over all the more options here, but obviously there's an abundance of them. You can turn sync on or off. Let's turn it off. And yeah, there's a delay time. Up to 10 seconds. It's quite a bit. Fade in time. Let's put this, say, at 1 second. So the craziness will fade in, fade out, and repeats. Like I mentioned before, the LFOs can also behave like envelopes. So let's say I pick this one. That's just 2 repeats. Or if few more. 19 is a bit too much. 1, 2, 3. Right. So a lot of options in here for the LFOs. Just to round out oscillator control on the VCA section, you've got control of panning, left and right panning, level obviously, and if you hit the more button, you have that control on a per synth basis. And then we touched on this briefly before, the output section has its more as well. This also gives you control over all 4 inserts and sends. So in the back are 4 TRS jacks, 4 jacks that can be split out to a send and to a return to either a mono or stereo effect. Audio gets routed from any synth you choose after the synth effect, we'll get to that in a bit, out to whatever effect you want, and then back in to be processed by the master effects. Okay, let's dive deeper into the mod matrix. Up until now, we've been creating modulations either using the hardwired mod sections, using destinations, but obviously behind all that is the mod matrix. Now, I've got to hand it to Moog here. One's mod matrix is the clearest implementation of a mod matrix I've ever seen, as well as the most powerful one, a lot in part to the screen and the clarity with which everything is laid out, but not just. A typical mod matrix has a source, an assignable destination, and mod depth, typically, hopefully, bipolar. Moog adds 2 additional layers to that, a controller and a transform. Let's start with the basics. You've got 20 mod matrix slots. To add one, you just hit the button, and then you can choose a mod source. I'll scroll through these briefly so you can look at them. It includes expression and CV inputs. Let's just go for, let's say LFO 4. Right, we saw that before. Let's scroll through the mod destinations, take a look at these. You've got groups on top. These are all the groups, and then when you press the master control, you have the individual parameters in that group. Okay, so let's say again, I want to go back to oscillator 1 and modulate its frequency. Right, so that's typical mod matrix stuff. Got a mod depth here, right, which is bipolar. Simple stuff. Now, the controller section lets you run this modulation through any one of the controllers you see here. Let's say, for example, why not go for pad pressure? So I can't hear anything now, but if I place pressure on the pad, it behaves as a controller for the modulation. Let's disable this. Transform lets you set either high or low limits for the modulations. So let's say set a low limit right up here and a high limit here. Right, a very interesting way to moderate the modulation or limit it to a specific range. And then there are also squared and cubed options. These make the transform exponentially faster. So controller and transform give a lot of expressive control to the mod matrix. You can add up to 20 entries into this mod matrix. You can easily delete entries if you like and disable them temporarily as well. 2 nice advanced functions in the mod matrix. If you have a lot of entries, you can hit shift and destination to see all the destinations that are controlled by a particular controller, and then clear that filter. And if you hit shift and the more button for a particular module, you'll see all the controllers that are affecting it. And then finally, if you have a complex mod matrix, you can save a setup and import that later on into other presets. Another neat way to quickly assign expression modulation is these buttons on the bottom. So say if I wanted the pad X axis to control pitch, I would just hit pad X, move again the frequency knob in the direction that I wanted, and now this pad can control pitch on the X axis. So those are pretty much all the mod matrix pros. The only con that I can think of is that the oscillators aren't available as modulation sources, at least not in this version of the firmware. So if you want to use the oscillators to modulate other oscillators or the filter, you'll need to use these knobs over here. You can, however, like I mentioned before, use control voltage if you wanted and assign that to any parameter you wanted across the mod matrix. Okay, let's take a look at the bottom section. You've got a master clock here, pretty straightforward for setting global tempo. There's a more info here that lets you set swing as well. The arpeggiator has all the features you'd expect. Support for multiple octaves. Variation on the order of the notes per octaves. You can go up or down or up and down for the octaves. And let's just simplify this for a bit. You've got pendulum control for a pattern back and forth. And then the typical up, down, order, or random options. And if you hit more info, you get a nice visualization as well as a few other options, gate length, and things you see here, a few options. Won't go over all of these, but standard stuff. Let's move on to the sequencer. The sequencer is polyphonic. It can have up to 64 steps in 4 pages of 16 steps each. There's a nice more display here as well. You can sequence either step by step, there's a visualization here. You can record while it's playing. You can set the sequence to either play, and then you can play on top of it, right? Or you can transpose it. There's an abundance of ways to edit it step by step. If you hit step edit, you get a grid with all the notes. I didn't see any limit, by the way, on polyphony on this. You can continue to add as many rows as you like. You've got velocity and gate as well as ratchet controls on a per step basis. Why not? Right. We just added a ratchet to this step. Let's do it here too. Now, aside from sequencing notes, you can also sequence modulation. So, right, let's say I wanted to sequence opening and closing the filter, go into modulations. You can record this in real time by hitting step mod. Notice this being recorded. Now, the slightly odd thing about this is that what you're recording when you move a knob or edit the steps is an offset to where the knob is at. Now, this can be viewed either as a good thing or as a bad thing. It's a good thing because you don't have the sequencer and the knob fighting each other and having these jumps back and forth. But it's a bad thing if you want to have absolute values. I didn't find a way to make absolute values. If it doesn't exist, Moog, it would be nice to have this in a future firmware update. Just like steps, you can edit the modulation on a step-by-step basis, and you can add additional rows, set a destination, just like in the mod matrix, and a parameter, say, yeah, VCA pan, why not? And then go ahead and set an offset on a step-by-step basis. You can continue to add rows, and I did try this. This goes up to 20, at least as of now. Mod sequences also support controllers with an amount control, so you can moderate any of these modulations with any of the controllers that you see here. I won't go into all these options. Obviously, I think a lot of it is self-explanatory. There are a few options here that I think it would have been nice if there was sort of like a tooltip or a little help. For example, in record mode, when you're recording live, replace and overdub makes sense. You're either replacing notes or adding notes. Focus is a nice mode that I had to open the manual to figure out what that means. It's pretty cool. You can play a pattern and only change the notes that are in the step that you want to edit. Other than that, I think a lot of this is self-explanatory. Okay, let's move on to chord mode. This will play a chord, which you can program. So I can program a chord with or without hearing it. That's an option as well. And I've now created a chord. This is a nice option either for playing chords, or in the event that 3 oscillators aren't enough for you, you can add additional intervals and layer oscillators that way, not just by layering synths. The hold function, as its name implies, will hold a note just like hitting a sustain pedal. Obviously this is useful for the arpeggiator. Oops. Right. Let's take a look at the Polyphony module. Typically, synth will play polyphonically. You can force mono if you want. And of course, add unison. So if you've got voices to spare, you can go anywhere from 2 to Hall 16 if you want. Right, Control detune. This is 16 oscillators. Let's add more. All the way to 48. Tune a bit maybe. Yep, so if you need it, you've got it. More realistically, a nice use for the polyphony section is to limit the amount of voices that each of the synths get. So let's say I wanted to play a bass line with synth 1, I could just limit it to 1 voice, and then I wanted to play, let's say, a pad with synth 2, let's limit it to 4, then another lead maybe with synth 3. It's a nice way to make sure that one synth doesn't steal voices from the other. Moving on down the bottom section, you can put basically an endless amount of presets on this. You've got over 3 gigabytes of storage. I don't know how much each preset takes, but there's quite a lot here. And you can sort by category, mood, or group. And you can assign, say, custom group names, right? So these are my presets, for example. Aside from that, you've got performance sets. You've got 8 banks of 8 presets, and you can load multiple performance sets. So either filter and look for presets here, or just set your favorites using this. This has a more function as well, so you can clearly see which presets are in which performance set. Okay, let's talk about the effects. Moog One has synth effects, 1 effect per synth, and then master effects, either 2 mono to stereo effects or 1 dual stereo effect. Both synth effects and master effects have all the effects by Moog, and then master effects also include reverbs by Eventide. Let's start with synth effects on our little 4-voice unison sound. Turn it on, go into more. Let's browse through these. You've got different effect types. These are all the available options. Let's choose, for example, ping pong delays, and then you've got different parameter settings here. Let's go to, say, bucket brigade delays, sample these guys. Right, so these are all presets. And we can always go into effect parameters, mess around with those. Pretty nice implementation here. So you've got plenty of parameters to mess with here, and these 2 knobs control typically the most popular ones. Clearly they knew I don't want to mess with time. But if you want these knobs to control different parameters, you just go into effect type and play around with what each one of them controls over here. Again, we won't go through all of these. There are quite a few of those. Aside from synth effects, which you get 1 of for each of the synths, you have master effects, which are... Let's turn this off. Eventide reverbs. Let's briefly take a look at what's available here. Eventide room, hall plate, shimmers. Always a favorite, right? Okay. Size matters. And of course you can edit the effect parameters. Why not increase the size? Quite a few parameters you can play with. Let's say pitch. I want this to go down instead of up. Nice. These two knobs control sends for the master effects. So all the way down and all the way up, and you've got control on a per synth basis for the sends. Now, even though you can use two master effects, you only get to use one eventide effect. Doesn't matter that much because they're typically reverbs and you may not want more than one of each. And all the other Moog effects are available as master effects as well. So there are quite a few of those. Obviously, I won't go through all of them. Let's just try phasers. Why not? Now, like I mentioned before, you have two master effects if you want. Right now it's in stereo mode, so we only get one, but if you move it to dual mono, then you've got two effects. Before I move to the pros and cons, let's take a look at a few interesting miscellaneous features. The compare button will let you compare preset to what it was when you first loaded it. It's pretty boring before, but useful function. Another useful function is snapshots. So let's say I load up this preset, which is very nice, by the way, little piano. I know this isn't supposed to be one, but it sounds pretty good. So let's say I start changing this preset and I reach something I like. I'm not sure I want to save it. I just press the snapshot button. And if I hit shift snapshot, you can see it saved that. So I can always go back to this. Now I can keep making changes. If I don't like those changes, jump back to a snapshot, then save it as a new preset if I like. Then another cool tiny one. There's a glide function, right, which can sound pretty bad for piano style sounds. But if we go to the, more info section and turn on glissando, then it'll go through the notes and I don't know, it's a cool effect. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons. Before we talk about general pros and cons, let's talk about 8 voices versus 16 voices for the Moog One. The 8 voice version costs $6,000. The 16 voice costs $8,000. Which should you get? Now, like I showed you before, you can get a lot done in 3 synths with just 8 voices. You know, a bass, a lead, and pads. There's plenty to go around with 8 voices. That said, a lot of the sound design charm of the Moog One is in layering synths and playing big chords, and every note in a chord obviously takes up another voice. So you can do quite a lot with an 8 voice Moog One, but the 16 voice certainly gives you more flexibility. On the other hand, you could get an 8 voice Moog One and for less than the difference buy a digital synth with, say, wavetable or sampling capabilities that Moog One just doesn't have and create your own diverse timbral palette that way. So given the ridiculous option of spending only $8,000 on synths and not $1 more, I'd probably go for the 8 voice along with another synth of a different character. But if you're considering a Moog One, you're probably looking for the ultimate or best analog synth. 16 voices will go a lot farther than just 8. So aside from that, let's talk about general pros and cons. On the cons side, I mentioned them before. Price, weight, and size are pretty obvious ones, unless of course you're looking for something big and impressive, which Moog One certainly is. Putting that consideration aside, being analog, while is certainly a pro for Moog One, is also somewhat of a limitation. It's probably the most advanced and, dare I say, the ultimate analog polysynth, but if you're looking for other forms of synthesis like wavetable, granular, sampling, or digital FM, Moog One doesn't have those. Finally, on the cons side, there are, at least currently, a few minor annoyances. The fan has been discussed a lot in forums, and I agree that in normal mode versus quiet mode, it can get quite loud. However, I've had this in low fan mode on for days without any issues. Low fan mode isn't totally quiet, but it's sort of like at slightly less than my MacBook and certainly less than the air conditioning I have going on now. Not a big deal, but it is there. Aside from that, there are a few issues, many of which I mentioned throughout this video, that you may consider as minor annoyances or big deals depending on what's important to you. The fact that at least as of version 1.1, while the filter does track the keyboard, you can't play it precisely like you can the oscillators, no micro timing on the sequencer, and the fact that the effects parameters aren't available as modulation destinations in the mod matrix. Now, all these things are things that when I mentioned to Moog, they said that they're aware of and are planning to address in future firmware updates. On the pros side, while MOOG ONE isn't the perfect synth, in terms of analog synths that I'm aware of, this is as good as it gets. Even if it wasn't tri-timbral, the tone generators, filters, and modulators are the best I've seen. Add to that the fact that you've got 3 sets of this with potentially 3 arpeggiators or 3 sequences running simultaneously. I can't imagine reaching for anything else when this is around for some creative analog fun. Add to that the fact that Moog has put together an excellent interface that puts almost all the features in very common sense locations, means that this is a synth you can easily come back to without reaching for a manual. And if you want dozens of sound design ideas for what to do with all this power, check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell after subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comments section below. Thanks for watching.